All right. Last Sunday we got about as far as verse 21 in our study of Paul as he is now, he has appealed to Caesar, and Festus happens to have the opportunity to involve Agrippa in the situation. Given the fact that Festus has no specifics to write to Caesar regarding the accusations or anything else, this is kind of like an opportunity for Festus to at least come up with something for which he can give a reason of having approved the request to be judged by Caesar. So here in verse 25, Paul, when we consider what Paul has said, he's offered up his defense before Festus, and now we see in verse 11, Paul says, I appeal to Caesar because Festus was wanting to bring Paul to Jerusalem, let Paul be judged in Jerusalem. There was not really any reason for that other than to appease the Jews. And of course, we know that the Jews were laying in wait to kill Paul, and Paul might have concluded the same thing anyway. So Paul appeals to Caesar. Festus says, fine, you'll go to Caesar. It doesn't seem like he's in a huge hurry. Again, he doesn't have much to write. Agrippa and Bernice come. Keep in mind, Agrippa and Bernice are brother and sister. They're in an incestuous relationship. But Agrippa has a lot of background information regarding Jesus and, for that matter, the apostles in the church. We talked a little bit last week about the different members of Agrippa's family that have played prominent roles, I guess you could say notorious prominent roles, in Christ's trial and beheading James and so forth. So there is background, there's a history here, but that still means that Agrippa does have a little bit more deeper understanding and knowledge about the Jewish mind and the Jewish law, considering Agrippa is himself a Jew. That having been said, it is notable that sometimes we use the phrase sell out. Okay, Agrippa would appear to be of that persuasion. In order to retain or to maintain, I guess you could say, this family lineage of authority and of rule, to a certain extent, Agrippa has sold out to the Romans. He is he does have authority, but he has submitted and yielded to the politics of Rome. We talked a little bit last week about how that Agrippa is in charge of putting certain high priests in place of the Roman figureheads of the Sanhedrin for the high priest. That's why we've got, at any given time, generally you have two high priests. You have the one according to the law, but then you have the one that Rome, through Agrippa, has placed there to kind of be their liaison to the Sanhedrin. So we pick up in verse 18 and 19. This is Festus as he is telling Agrippa kind of the story, kind of what's happened. Agrippa, will you help me out here? I don't know what to do about this. Verse 19, they had some questions about him, about their own religion, and about a certain Jesus who had died, whom Paul, he says he's alive. Verse 20, because I was uncertain of such questions. And Festus, to a certain extent, you can almost say poor Festus, because Felix, he'd been there for some time. At least he had a little bit of background in some of this. Felix was able to kind of just play both sides a little bit and kind of just pass the buck on to the next guy coming in. Festus, he's just kind of all of a sudden being blasted with this, kind of put in a very difficult situation. I'm not saying Festus is innocent or he's a good guy necessarily. I'm just saying that from a political perspective, I'm sure this wasn't on his docket to deal with immediately after he takes the job. So in verse 20, because I was uncertain, I asked whether he was willing to go to Jerusalem. We know that the Sanhedrin asked if he would allow him to come to Jerusalem. He was wanting to pressure Paul to take him to Jerusalem to do the Jews a favor, Festus was. Verse 21, but when Paul appealed to be reserved for the decision of Augustus, I commanded him to be kept until I could send him to Caesar. Read between the lines there, until I could figure out what to write in sending him to Caesar. Verse 22, Agrippa said to Festus, I also would like to hear the man myself. And so Festus replies, tomorrow you shall hear him. So Agrippa, Agrippa, he has to kind of play a line here between the Jews and the Romans. On the Romans' end, he wants to do everything he can to appease them, to maintain his position, his authority, his wealth. But on the Jewish end, he kind of has to placate both ends of this. And of course, he's a Jew himself. And so when Agrippa says, hey, I'd like to hear about this myself, I tend to think this is a political thing. Okay, he wants to involve himself in this simply from the perspective that, if anything, if this is the only thing that might come out of it, is that in the letter being written to Caesar, Festus can say, I and King Agrippa have both examined Paul, and we're sending him on to you because he's appealed to you as a Roman citizen, and here's what we have discovered or whatever. I tend to think that Agrippa, he's not necessarily, this isn't like, oh, I want to hear about the truth of the gospel. I don't think that's in the mind of Agrippa at all. This is more of a political thing, and as we're going to see, the kind of the pomp and circumstance surrounding it, there is a sense in which it kind of contributed to his ego. Okay, and we know that people in his family, such as Herod, that was struck with worms when he was receiving the praise of having the voice of a god, and God struck him with worms. We know this runs in the family. So an ego is that's kind of part of the lineage here. So, starting in verse 23. So the next day when Agrippa and Bernice had come with great pomp and had entered the auditorium with the commanders and the prominent men of the city, at Festus's command, Paul was brought in. Festus said, so you have this procession, you have this almost like a parade with Agrippa and Bernice. So you kind of have this royal welcome, if you will, to the court of Festus. You have, notice who else you have here. This isn't just a small little group of people. You've got the commanders and the prominent men of the city also there. Okay, so this is kind of a big deal with all of these people. Before, with Felix, we know at least that the Jews, the leaders of the Jews, the elders and the scribes and so forth, were there to accuse Paul. Felix was there, probably some lieutenants that Felix had, part of the government there in Caesarea would have been with Felix. The first time Festus examined him, again, there were the Jews, but not necessarily this great big spectacle. Okay, this is a little bit different. This almost feels more like a spectacle for the sake of having a spectacle. More so than trying to get to the bottom of the truth, or trying to, Agrippa wanting to insert himself on behalf of a fellow Jew in Paul. I don't think this isn't a motivation that is noble. All right, verse 23, or verse 24 rather. Festus said, King Agrippa and all the men who are here present with us, you see this man about whom the whole assembly of the Jews petitioned me, both at Jerusalem and here, crying out that he was not fit to live any longer. But when I found that he had committed nothing deserving of death, and that he himself had appealed to Augustus, I decided to send him. So Festus starts out, he recognizes that the whole assembly of the Jews, which is to say the Sanhedrin, the ruling body of the Jews, petitioned me to bring Paul, or to allow Paul to come to Jerusalem to be judged. Verse 25, even though Festus doesn't necessarily say those exact words in the previous proceeding that we saw, he says, I found that he committed nothing deserving of death, which is to say, he recognized that this was a question regarding the religion of the Jews. Again, what we learned from Festus and that whole interaction the first time through was more so that Festus was trying to work this into a way to gain some brownie points with the Jews. As far as what Luke records for us, at no point did he exclaim or rule, I find nothing deserving of death in him. Okay, Pilate, kind of similar to what Pilate said about Jesus, but Pilate actually was willing to say that on the record, so to speak. As far as Festus is putting this forward, he's framing it favorably for himself. Okay, and I tend to think he never actually on the record said this, but this is his reasoning now for being able to bring Agrippa into the situation. So when he says there in verse 25, when I found that he had committed nothing deserving of death, that he himself had appealed to Augustus. We talked last week that this isn't the actual proper name of the Caesar that was on the throne at this time. This is Nero, but Caesar Augustus was like a title. Okay, it started back as like 21 BC, where Caesar Augustus was a title that many of the Caesars took on. Augustus kind of carries with it the idea of reverence, an august person, someone that should be held in high esteem. So it's not the name of. Nero is the Caesar at this point. Caesar Augustus would be Nero. I decided to send him. That's true. Festus doesn't have much of a choice. Okay, Paul appealed to Caesar on the basis of his citizenship as a Roman. Festus doesn't have a lot of wiggle room here regarding Roman law. And since there's nothing specific of Roman law that Paul has committed, no accusation pertaining to Roman law has been committed, this is simply a local issue. That's really what the problem is. And that's why he says what he says in verse 26. I have nothing certain to write to my Lord concerning him, which is Caesar. Therefore I have brought him out before you, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that after the examination has taken place, I may have something to write. For it seems to me unreasonable to send a prisoner and not to specify the charges against him. So, Festus, and again, this is more for the benefit of the court, given the fact that he and Agrippa had already discussed this prior, okay? But the fact that when he says, I have nothing certain to write to my Lord concerning him. Yeah, that is an issue. Okay, Festus would have been held accountable if he sends Paul with nothing written, nothing acknowledged, no accusations made, except other than Paul's appealed to you. Well, what for? You're wasting my time. And so Festus needs something specific to say, hey, this is an issue, this is a problem, and to that end, Roman law needs to be able to be applied in that situation. That's going to be difficult, obviously, and that's why Festus is in the position that he's in. So he brings him out, but notice the way Festus frames it, I'm bringing him out before all of you, especially you, King Agrippa. So you kind of picture Festus, he's addressing the whole court here. This includes these prominent men of the city. Okay, so the way Festus is framing this is, I'm presenting, I want all of you to hear what Paul has to say and see if you can weigh in on this, especially you, King Agrippa, so that after the examination has taken place, I may have something to write. I need something specific to say, and I just don't know what to tell him. And again, Festus doesn't have any background as a Jew, so it makes sense. Verse 27, it seems unreasonable to send a prisoner, really unreasonable, to send a prisoner. Again, keep in mind, these terms here, Paul's not in shackles. Okay, he cannot be in shackles. He's a Roman citizen. There is no accusation specific under Roman law that has been made against him. So when he says a prisoner, this is someone who is being kept, whether you want to call it house arrest or protective custody, not to specify the accusations, the charges against him, which is to say, by proper due process of Roman law, he cannot be a prisoner without proper charges. And that's the issue. Paul has appealed to Caesar without even having been officially charged with anything under Roman law. That is the problem. It's under Jewish law, and really to that end, no actual eyewitnesses have been provided by the Jews. It's hearsay. It's second and third hand hearsay. And as a result, Festus really is between a rock and a hard place here. It's a very difficult situation for him. And so he brings this really mainly, this is all about Agrippa, because Agrippa does have Jewish background. He can give some insight into this. Anything through verse 27? All right. Let's cover our questions for chapter 25 before we get into chapter 26. And by the way, I completely forgot to put out chapter 26 notes on Wednesday night. They are on the table now. So if anybody wants the chapter 26 notes after class, feel free to go get some. Question 1 for Acts chapter 25, judging by Paul's defense. So this is really his second defense. He had the first one with Felix, now the second one with Festus. What were at least 3, and when I say accusations, this is a broad sense, that the Jews made before Festus against Paul. We don't hear what the Jews said specifically. Okay, remember when we talked about there in the early part of chapter 25, it sounds as if it's pretty much the same stuff that they said before. But there are 3 specific things that Paul says, that Paul himself addresses, that may give us kind of a clue as to what some of the main issues were that the Jews were attempting to try to pin on Paul. What were those?
Roman law, Jewish civil law, spiritual.
And the temple, yeah. You had the civil law of the Jews, I've done nothing wrong. I've done nothing wrong against Caesar. Okay, so Roman law isn't a part of this either. And I haven't done anything against the temple, which is to say, I haven't defiled anything relating to the spiritual law of the Jews. I'm not guilty of the things that they're saying that I am. And when you look at the accusations against Paul the first time, when Felix was there and they offered up these accusations, you can kind of get the feeling that the Jews were trying to downplay from a certain perspective the issues surrounding Paul, because they wanted him to be brought back to Jerusalem so they could kill him. The only way to do that was get him out of the custody of the Romans by Felix declaring, you know what, we're not going to get involved. This is a local thing. Y'all take care of it. Well, the stakes have risen some at this point. Okay, and to a certain extent, the stakes are really, in a lot of ways, if Festus refuses, let's say if Festus releases Paul or in any way refuses to punish Paul or allow him to be punished by the Jews, which is what the request is from the Jews to Festus, there's likely going to be some sort of a political consequence as a result. Okay, possibly riot, certainly bad blood between the new governor and the Sanhedrin. And so the Jews are taking those same accusations, but they're painting them, they're framing them, just as we saw them do in chapter 24. They're framing them in such a way as to try to bring leverage on Festus to let Paul come to Jerusalem to get to the bottom of it, because this is a serious issue. That's what the way the Jews were framing it. This is a serious thing for us, and we need to get to the bottom of it. We want to take care of this. And so that's why Paul defends and says what he says. Anything else to question 1 of chapter 25? Chapter 2. Why does Paul appeal to Caesar instead of going to Jerusalem? Why do you think he does that?
He said he's not allowing anyone to turn him back over to the Jews.
Yeah. It's not in your right, Festus, to do this. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if Paul already kind of figured that, well, they already planned to kill me before. 2 years later, those who are really invested in this, they're still going to want to kill me. Okay? Oh, yeah. I mean, you got to figure 40-plus fellows are still not eating and drinking, right? So you got Paul, he says, listen, it's not in your right to hand me over to the Jews. I've appealed to Caesar, and I have rights as a Roman citizen. And that kind of goes into part 2 of question 2. In what difficult position does this place Festus? It's a very difficult position, because there is nothing under Roman law by which Festus should be keeping him. He should let him go, but if he lets him go, the Jews go ballistic. So there's a problem. And that's why it's such a precarious position. Question 2. Anything else to question 2? Question 3. Why does Festus appeal to Agrippa? Part A. Why does Festus appeal to Agrippa? Yeah. Festus figures, hey, you're an expert on the Jews. Maybe you have some insight into this that I have absolutely no background in understanding. And that's you can say that's a wise move. I think that's appropriate. Most of us, if in the same position, we would want to kind of have some background too. And to a certain extent, I think it is political, but at least give some credit to Festus in that he didn't just override Paul and say, no, I'm sending you back to Jerusalem anyway. Of course, then you get into that whole legality of that since he appealed to Caesar, but there are no charges being brought against him under Roman law. So how can he appeal to Caesar without charges? Thus, the dilemma. Ben?
I just thought something, could be that he was also kind of wanting to share blame if they release Paul or something like
Yeah.
that.
Float together, sink together.
You know,
Could be. Could be.
as a manager, I have a lot of employees kind of want me to make a decision that might not be popular for a member or customer, and it's like, you know the answer.
Yeah.
Go ahead. You don't need me to back you up.
Yeah.
I'm just gonna have to tell them no or whatever the answer is.
Yeah. Yeah, that could be. I hadn't thought about that. Because on Agrippa's end, he might be seeing the potential for some sort of political prestige, I guess you could say. And it's possible that on Festus's end, he's kind of seeing this as a kind of a, I don't know, a safety valve, I guess you could say.
It's a lot easier to go back and say, well, my boss said no.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Well, Caesar, I appealed to the expert, and this is what he said. So, I did the best I could here. That's a good point. I hadn't thought about that. Yeah. All right. Why is Agrippa more qualified to hear and understand Paul? He's a Jew.
The differences and sects and
Yeah.
all
Well, and his personal family's history with Jesus himself, with James, okay, the Apostle James, back in beginning first handful of chapters in Acts chapter, I think Acts chapter 12, where James is beheaded by Herod. So you've got some personal history here on behalf of Agrippa. So yeah, in addition to his background and knowledge of Jews in general and their belief systems, there's personal history with regard to, even though Festus may not know this, but certainly Agrippa was probably the ideal expert to bring in this particular situation, regardless of the political maneuverings taking place on both sides. All right? Anything else? There are questions for chapter 25. Yes, ma'am.
question. I have a note in my Bible, and I haven't done any extensive study on Festus or Felix myself, but it says Festus died in office after 2 years, but his record for that time shows wisdom and honesty superior to both his predecessor Felix and his successor Albinus, which is all relative, I'm sure.
Sure, yeah.
I don't know,
Yeah.
but he could very well have good intentions of
Sure.
bringing Agrippa in and
Yeah.
really be in between a rock and a hard place, trying to do the right thing. So I don't
Yeah. Well,
know who says that.
and to be fair, Festus, this was the first thing apparently brought to Festus's plate as governor when he's just there to introduce himself. Okay? So, again, I think his desire to allow Paul to be brought to Jerusalem, it was a political thing. But there was also a sense in which Roman law had no real jurisdiction in the discussion because it wasn't about Roman law. And Festus, I think, understood that to a certain extent. That's why he says what he says with Agrippa, is that there's really nothing that Roman law can say here. So that's why initially he wanted to let him go back to Jerusalem and to do the Jews a favor. Why not? I mean, this really isn't my expertise. This is not really my jurisdiction. The only real major kind of pebble here that's messing the whole gear thing up is the fact that Paul's a Roman citizen. That's the big problem. And now he's appealed to Caesar. Yeah. So, I mean, I don't want to put necessarily any negative motivations on Festus. He's a politician, but having said that, I don't think there's necessarily anything dishonest about what he's saying. He doesn't know about the threat against Paul's life, the plan against Paul's life sending them back to Jerusalem. He wouldn't know that. And if he did, I doubt he would be involved as much as he is, because this is a Roman citizen. And if he knowingly put a Roman citizen in harm's way or gets killed, that's a problem. Anything else through our questions for chapter 25? All right, chapter 26. So chapter 26 is a little bit more involved in terms of both, at least what Luke records of Paul's defense, as well as what Paul seems to do with regard to not just necessarily what Luke records, but just kind of the broad aspect of the fact that now Paul's before a Jew. And this provides Paul a little bit more ability to extrapolate on and explain kind of his background. This is something Agrippa will appreciate, where Felix and Festus probably didn't know a Sadducee from a Pharisee. Well, Felix might have, but certainly Festus at this point probably doesn't know that much. But Agrippa does. And so Paul's going to be able to relate to him and establish a connection with him on that background basis of having this Jewish faith, which goes, I mean, that's Paul's pattern. Okay, you start where the person is, and to a certain extent, that Paul's not really doing this for himself. He's already appealed to Caesar. This isn't going to change a whole lot, really. And remember what Festus said, the purpose was, I need to know what to write to Caesar. Okay, Paul's appealed to Caesar. Apparently, once you appealed to Caesar, that was it. You can't just up and say, oh, never mind. Once you appeal, you appeal. And so Paul's not making a defense. This isn't a matter of, well, maybe we'll send you, maybe we won't. No, Paul's appealed. And there is no choice here. This is more for Paul. I mean, before he got to talk to Felix, then he got to talk to Festus. Now he has the prominent people in the city, and Festus once again, and Agrippa and Bernice. Paul's going to make the most of this opportunity, both to Agrippa, and even though he doesn't particularly address Bernice, Bernice is sitting there too. And she has background as a Jew. So she knows what he's talking about. Starting with verse 1, Agrippa said to Paul, you are permitted to speak for yourself. So Paul stretched out his hand and answered for himself. Verse 2, I think myself happy, King Agrippa, because today I shall answer for myself before you concerning all the things of which I am accused by the Jews, especially because you are an expert, or you are expert in all customs and questions which have to do with the Jews. Therefore, I beg you to hear me patiently. Which is to say, Paul's going to start at the beginning. Okay, that's why he says, hear me patiently. Let me lay out for you exactly what this situation entails. So when he says, I think myself happy, verse 2, why was Paul happy to be able to answer for himself regarding the accusations the Jews made?
Well, I don't know for sure, but I know that when he was on the road to Damascus and went on in and Ananias was told to go to him, he said, he's a chosen instrument to bear my name for the Gentiles and kings, all the sons of Israel. So he was fulfilling that specific.
Right. Well, and if it wasn't enough that you had Felix and Festus to be able to defend himself and to talk about the gospel, that's really what, all this was kind of an avenue to do. Now he has an opportunity to do it with Agrippa. And that really, when he says, I'm happy to do this, which is to say, there is a sense of joy. Remember, we've talked about the difference between happiness and joy, okay? Happiness is an emotion. It comes, it goes, for reasons, sometimes for no reason. But joy is an attitude. It's a mindset. It is a recognition of blessedness and being content in the fact that I'm blessed, even when things aren't going my way. And that's joy. And so when Paul says, I think myself happy, King Agrippa, there is a sense of joy that Paul has, even though I'm sure Paul would much rather be free. Let me do my thing, and the Jews won't be after me, and let me go and preach the gospel, and stop. I mean, he spent 2 years in the custody of Felix. I mean, in that 2 years, I'm sure he was continuing to teach. He certainly, I'm sure, encouraged the brethren in Caesarea, but 2 years, he's just stuck there, okay? And so, but he knows this is an opportunity for him. And so I think that's kind of the main point that he makes here in verse 2, especially because you're going to know what I'm talking about. Okay, and we're going to see the effect this has on Agrippa. Almost you persuaded me to be a Christian. Because Agrippa knows the background. He knows the prophets. He knows the law. He knows the prophecies. And as a result, the things that Paul's going to say, and the reason he starts at the very beginning, is to appeal to that side of Agrippa.
The Jews have been the main voice in this
Yeah,
over and
yeah.
over.
And, that's a great point, too. Herod, I guess, is really the first outside third objective party that is also a Jew involved in this entire scenario. Because before it's always been the Jews of Jerusalem there to accuse Paul. This is the only other time we have an outside Jew with no particular horse in the race, I guess you could say. I'm sure he had heard of Paul at some point. I'm sure his name has come up. But he wasn't there in Jerusalem. He's not a part of that crowd trying to get him killed. So for all intents and purposes, he's a third objective party. But he's a Jew. Yeah. So verse 3, especially because you're an expert in all customs and questions. That includes the Pharisees, Sadducees, the Essenes, all these different little groups of what the different groups of the Jews believed. Therefore, I beg you to hear me patiently. My manner of life, anything through verse 3. My manner of life from my youth, which was spent from the beginning among my own nation at Jerusalem, all the Jews know. Was Paul born in Jerusalem? He was born in Tarsus. Okay, remember that was no mean city. Paul told the centurion, or not the centurion, the commander Lysias. It was a well-known city. Paul was born free, but where does Paul say he was raised? Jerusalem. Okay. Again, he's kind of a hybrid between of the dispersion versus homegrown. Remember, we talked about kind of the difference, how the Jews kind of saw the Jews of the dispersion as not really being full-blown Jews, I guess you could say. Not quite the same. Beginning among my own nation at Jerusalem, all the Jews know, verse 4, they knew, verse 5, they knew me from the first, if they were willing to testify that according to the strictest sect of our religion, I lived a Pharisee. Certainly, Paul's association with the Sanhedrin was a part of what Paul's saying here in verse 5. Okay? I don't think Paul was an actual member of the Sanhedrin, but to say that certainly there's evidence to suggest he was an officer of the Sanhedrin, I think that's absolutely fair to say. He went to the Sanhedrin and received papers of authority to go and arrest Christians in Damascus and bring them back to Jerusalem. So he certainly has connections to the Sanhedrin. Keep in mind, his mentor, basically, for all intents and purposes, the man who raised him, Gamaliel, was apparently a very key component of the Sanhedrin for a long time. So even though Paul may not have been a full-fledged member of the Sanhedrin, that was generally reserved for elders of the people. When I say elders, I mean older men. And all the evidence points to Paul not quite being old enough to necessarily be a part of the actual Sanhedrin, but an officer of the Sanhedrin, certainly. So when he says in verse 5, they knew me from the first, if they were willing to testify, that according to the strictest sect of our religion, I lived a Pharisee. Paul, I was one of them. And not only that, but he was not just one of them as a Jew, he was one of them as the part of the authority head of the Jews. He was attached to the Sanhedrin. They know me, which is to say, there is, on some level, a little bit of personal history here. Okay? Did I see a hand somewhere? I thought I did. And I was thinking and talking and not paying attention. Okay. All right, so anything through verse 5? All right. Verse 6, now I stand and am judged for the hope of the promise made by God to our fathers. Is this virtually the same thing that he said in the midst of the Sanhedrin? Because of the hope of what was he being judged? What did he say this to the Sanhedrin? You remember? That set the Pharisees and the Sadducees against each other? The resurrection. Yeah, because of the hope of the resurrection, I'm being judged before you now. So when Paul brings this up, I stand and am judged for the hope. Notice how Paul phrases this. We know he's talking about the resurrection because that's what he had said before. he refers to the resurrection as the promise made by God to our fathers. To this promise, verse 7, our 12 tribes, earnestly serving God night and day, hope to attain. For this hope's sake, King Agrippa, I am accused by the Jews. Why should it be thought incredible to you, or by you, that God raises the dead? So this confirms the fact that Paul is discussing the resurrection of the dead. But notice what he says about it, that it was a promise made by God. When did God ever promise the fathers the resurrection from the dead? Who are the fathers? Let's define that first. Who were the fathers? Sorry? Okay, the older generations. When you would say the fathers of the Jews, okay, we know that people like Elijah, they represented the prophets, but he wasn't really considered Father Elijah. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Okay, always used in that vein regarding the fathers of the Jews. It started with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Okay, and not even Moses. Moses represented the law. He was the lawgiver, so to speak, but he wasn't considered a father of the Jews. Abraham was the father of the Jews, our father Abraham. So what was it that God promised the fathers, not just Father Abraham, but the fathers, regarding the resurrection from the dead? Okay, so there's the promise to Abraham that through your seed all the nations of the earth will be blessed. There is some implication, which we know as Christians, looking back on what God, when he said that, what that meant, that there was a sense of, that's a spiritual promise, not a physical one. That's where the Jews, they thought it was physical. Paul associates that in Galatians chapter 3 and chapter 4. Paul says the promise was to your seed, not seeds as in plural, but seed as in singular, which is Christ. Okay, that Jesus is the fulfillment of that promise. To the end that we could have forgiveness of our sins and a hope of in heaven. But the linchpin in that entire plan of salvation is what act by God in the last day. In order for the plan of salvation to do anything, to mean anything, in order for our forgiveness of sins to actually count for anything, what has to happen? We have to be raised from the dead, don't we? We can be forgiven of sins all day long, but if we're never going to be raised from the dead, what difference does it make? Forgiveness of sins is a means to an end. But going further than that, even beyond the initial promise to Abraham, at what other point did Jesus, when he was speaking to the Sadducees in Matthew chapter 22, Jesus said that the law itself teaches you about the resurrection of the dead? What was it that God said even after Abraham and Isaac and Jacob had died that taught that he would raise them from the dead? You remember what Jesus said to them? When the Sadducees were talking about this woman, and there's 7 brothers, and each one of those brothers, she's married to the first one, he dies, and each one takes her, and they all die.
He's the God of the living, not the dead.
Scripture said, okay, first of all, Jesus says, you do err not knowing the Scriptures are the power of God. For in the resurrection they're neither married nor given in marriage, but are like the angels of heaven. But then he goes on to describe, regarding the resurrection, here's what you don't understand or seem to not want to understand. Jehovah says, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. Over and over and over again throughout the Old Testament, that is recorded. That's not to say that God says that because Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are still alive. Yes, their spirit still exists. They're in Hades, the realm of the dead. But that's not what Jesus is describing. God says, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. For that to be true, God speaks it as if it were true because he's going to raise them from the dead. That's how it speaks to the resurrection. That's why Jesus uses that to defend the concept of the resurrection from the dead. So when Paul makes this statement, for the hope of the promise made by God to our fathers, And granted, the promise to Abraham regarding all the nations of the earth being blessed, that would proceed to each generation. But it wasn't just that singular promise either. Everything that God said backed up that initial promise by describing this event that was going to take place, or I guess you could say implying that event that is going to take place. Okay? Anything through verse 6. God made this promise. Keep in mind the Sadducees, they don't believe in this. All right? Their hope and trust is in the physical. This is why they had all the wealth. They accumulated as much as they could. That's where their power kind of came from. But the Sadducees were not the majority of the Jews. They were a small sect of the Jews, yet they held most of the power because they held most of the wealth. So when he describes the fact that he, verse 7, to this promise our 12 tribes earnestly serving God night and day hope to attain. At this point, okay, the 12 tribes don't exist. That's not what Paul's point is. He's not saying that the 12 tribes exist again. He's describing Israel as a whole. Okay? The 10 tribes that were taken away by Assyria, Israel taken away into captivity, they've all kind of been lost and dispersed. It's referred to as the lost 10 tribes. But Judah, made up of Judah and Benjamin, they were taken away into Babylon. They were the ones that came back to Jerusalem, were allowed back after the exile, and ultimately have formed this group of this people. There were still some Jews that, had their lineage, genealogies that they still held to. But what Paul's saying here, this promise, our 12 tribes, this is why we have done what we've always done. This is why we've served God in the temple, serving God night and day, because we hope to attain the resurrection from the dead. That's what we're looking forward to. That's what we want. For this hope's sake, King Agrippa, I am accused by the Jews, which is ironic. He doesn't say Sadducees. He says Jews. And there's a reason for that. Yes, the Sadducees were ideologically opposed to the idea of a resurrection from the dead. But the irony is that even the Pharisees were against Paul too. Not because of the concept of the resurrection of the dead, but because of what Paul taught it was fulfilled in, which is Christ Jesus, that Christ was the Messiah and that he has put away the old law. When you get right down to it, it didn't matter if it was Pharisee or Sadducee. They were accusing me because of the hope of the resurrection, which has been realized in Christ. That's why Christ is referred to as the first fruits of them that slept in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. He became the first one to be raised, never to die again. And it is that concept that was a threat to not just the Sadducees, but the Pharisees as well. Because if that were true, the entire prospect of how they viewed their nationality and the promise of a physical Messiah with a physical throne and a physical kingdom meant nothing. And they couldn't bring themselves to accept that. Okay, we'll pick up with verse 7 next week. Don't forget the Acts chapter 26 notes are on the back table. It's just Acts 26 all on one page. We'll have chapter 27 and 28 all on one page also in the next couple weeks. Thank you, everybody, for thoughts and comments.